The arcades. Long before the mid-2000s, arcade centers are great for social gathering, getting together with friends, eating some pizza, and insert quarters to play games. There's always fun times to be had in an arcade center.
These days, with the advent of online play on consoles, arcades have become very niche and rare, at least here in North America, but arcades are still going strong in Japan.
Many of these great arcades would see toned-down ports on consoles like the Genesis or SNES, but as time moves on, eventually the actual arcade ports would be released in their purest form, either on compilations like Capcom Classics Collection, see them on PS4 or Switch as part of the Arcade Archive series, or see companies like Arcade 1-Up use many of these ROMs and manufacture their multi-game Arcade 1-Up machines for the home.
However, there are still some arcade games out there that have yet to see a home release. So I compiled a list of 20 games that I think deserves a home release in some form or another. Why top 20? Why keep things on top 10 when you can double down? So, sit back and enjoy my top 20 arcade games that deserve a home release. Right here on my countdown show that I like to call Top of the Game Chain. In order for me to even make this video, I had to use the program MAME to play and record these games. And I'm referring to these games for educational purposes only. So if you're planning on playing these games with MAME, be sure to follow the rules and do so carefully. I will also use some footages from longplays.org, as I couldn't find really good emulation for some of these games. But I will credit them eventually later in this video.
Before I start the countdown, I will set some rules for this episode as not every game will be featured in this countdown. 1. If an arcade game gets ported to home consoles, in its purest form or toned down, and regardless of nation it's released at, it's still considered a home release and will not be counted. A good example is that the Fist of the North Star fighting game saw a worldwide release in the arcades but got a home release for the PS2 in Japan only. Despite being exclusive to home consoles in Japan, it's still considered a home release in general, and therefore won't be counted. Going off topic a little bit, the fighting game is actually really fun, and I suggest trying it out. 2. If an arcade game comes out as part of the Arcade Archives, they won't count. 3. If an arcade game is released via Arcade 1-Up, they will not count as it is a home release. So don't expect the Punisher Arcade to be accounted for in this countdown. 4. Games previously available and later delisted from services such as Xbox Live, for example, will not be considered. So don't expect the X-Men or Simpsons Arcade to be in the list, as much as we want them to be in it. 5. Alien vs. Predator, well, the good one anyway from Capcom, will not be in this list because technically it did see a home release via the plug-and-play Capcom Home Arcade Stick. 6. The Dungeons & Dragons collection will not be in the list as it did get released in the following: the Sega Saturn in Japan, and then worldwide for the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, and Steam. And finally, number 7, don't expect for Battletoads Arcade to show up in the list because it was released on Xbox One by way of the rare replay. With that said, let's get this countdown rolling. And we'll start things off with an unreleased sequel of an old fighting game. Remember Primal Rage? That Mortal Kombat clone where you're controlling giant apes and dinosaurs fighting to the death in a post-apocalyptic Earth? Even though I didn't know how to pull off some moves, I still had some enjoyment when I played the game on consoles. But what many not know, not even myself, is that there's a sequel that has been completed but never released, Primal Rage 2. From what I read, it is said that Atari games didn't really went too far to production even though they really did, but they also feared that it wouldn't generate enough sales due to other successful fighting games like Mortal Kombat 3. It is also said that an arcade test cabinet for this game was featured in 2001 in California, and then in 2012, it was reported that 2 circuit boards of the game are considered existed. However, in 2017, one person in the modding community had modified an existing MAME program to help run this game only, and while obviously not perfect, it actually runs well. As far as testing the game out personally, Primal Rage 2 plays no different from the first game, but it has seen some additions. For one thing, the characters you're playing are giant humans, which according to the lore of Primal Rage, are avatars of the first game's characters. Which brings me to the next addition, and that's the gauge below the screen, in which the avatars can temporarily morph into their respective beast forms that we know from the first game. I've also seen gameplay videos from other channels that the beasts themselves are also playable and can morph into their avatars when at full gauge. When I played it, some moves are easy to pull off while others remain difficult, and the game itself still feels hard, but I had a decent time with it. The game overall is decent, and the design is well done for an unreleased game. Hopefully this game will get noticed and be released in current generation consoles real soon. Here's an obscure game from Sega. It's Sega Sonic the Hedgehog. We all know Sonic, that speedy blue hedgehog that has so many games, but this one in particular never got a home release. Depending on the arcade board settings, you can have up to 3 players. Each player controlling Sonic the Hedgehog, Mighty the Armadillo, who would later appear in Knuckles Chaotix and Sonic Mania Plus, or Ray the Squirrel, who never appeared in any other game until Sonic Mania Plus. This game is unique in that you only have one button to jump, and you're controlling characters with a trackball.
Fortunately for me, I have a USB mouse with a trackball. However, trying to record footage for the game is a real pain in my neck, if only because of the amount of calibrations I had to put for the trackball. And even then, it's really hard to play the game with this trackball, because given the fact that you also have a jump button, I had to try to move this trackball as fast as I can and then jump at the precise moment so I won't get killed. And, well, needless to say, even with the right calibration, there's a chance that I'm not going to get through the game so easily.
The whole game is just your chosen character trying to escape traps that are set up by Dr. Eggman, and that's very much it. You don't get to fight any enemies at all. You're just doing all you can to find a goal of each stage. I still find it surprising that Sonic the Fighters was actually made available for PlayStation 3, yet Sega Sonic the Hedgehog didn't. And it is said that the reason for not porting it is because it'll be hard to emulate trackball controls. That to me is a poor excuse, especially if you can consider other games like Crystal Castles, an arcade game that uses a trackball, was emulated and converted into analog stick or D-pad used for the Atari Anthology on Xbox. Overall, the game looks nice on the graphics and concept, but because of the premise, the game comes off more as a novelty and can only be enjoyed in short bursts. Still a decent game to try out, and should this ever get released in current hardware, hopefully you'll have 2 more players to join in. Coming in at 18 is Nemo. No, not the Pixar fish, but this comic strip series of a little boy named Nemo who would often dreamed himself emerging into a magical fantasy realm. And this plot would see an animated film in 1989 in Japan and 1992 in the US as Little Nemo in Slumberland. Those that do know Nemo would remember the NES game Little Nemo the Dream Master, which is an entertaining platformer, but the game itself is downright hard, especially on that train level. And when you know it, the arcade game starts out at the train level, but thankfully it's a very straightforward level without too many hazards. The game can be played with 2 players, with player 1 as Nemo and player 2 as his ally Flip, armed with magical weapons going through 7 stages en route to the Nightmare King, the film's antagonist. It's also a run and gun shooter, battling enemies in strange Alice in Wonderland-like settings. Though simple, the game is actually fun since you are well armed, and the stages in the game are designed really well that you won't feel frustrated and won't get killed that much. And the graphics are not only rich in color, but they also convey the magical fantasy setting just like in the film. I think the reason this arcade version of Nemo didn't get a home release is partly due to licensing, since it is based on an animated film. But should the game's developer, Capcom, somehow regain the license, hopefully they'll release it on home consoles, with the Switch being the perfect console for it. Yo Joe! Coming in at number 17 is G.I. Joe The Arcade. For the uninitiated, G.I. Joe was originally a line of action figures that started in 1964, centering in 4 different branches of the United States military. Though the G.I. Joe brand would be rebooted in 1982, centering on the Special Ops Forces bearing the same name as the series title, going against a terrorist group called Cobra. It became so popular that it spawned many action figures, TV shows, films, and of course video games, with many only remembering the 2 games on the NES, which just like Little Nemo on NES, they are very good games, but still difficult to play. However, very few would remember the arcade game's existence. Developed in 1992, the gameplay of G.I. Joe Arcade is a third-person rail shooter, similar to that of another game called Cabal. You can play up to 4 players, although all 4 Joes play the same, as it's just cosmetic change. Though it is strange for Snake Eyes to hear him yell out "Yo Joe" when anybody who knows the series, Snake Eyes has always been silent. Unlike Cabal, the screen moves vertically and automatically as you're blasting your way to sections in many of Cobra's bases. The joystick moves both your chosen Joe and your aiming reticle along with it, and you're armed with a machine gun with infinite ammunition and a limited supply of missiles. You'll mostly spend your time blasting every enemy and obstacles that get in your path, but because both movement and reticle are on the same joystick, not only should you aim carefully, but you also gotta make sure that your Joe doesn't get hit by Cobra fire or collide with something. The graphics are nicely done, the gameplay is good, the forward scrolling effect is really good as it gives you the feel that you're part of the action like you would see in the TV show, and the music also fits well with the atmosphere, especially the very first stage music, which is actually the opening to the 1990 seasons. Just like Nemo, this is also a licensed game, but should the developer regain the license to this game, I would be happy to see this game show up on services like the PlayStation Network.
Yo, Joe!
When it comes to arcades, you gotta have the beat 'em up genre, so I'm including the obscure Gaia Crusaders in this countdown. The plot involves an evil demon being released from his seal and begins conquering the earth, and a mystical artifact is the key to sealing him back, only for it to be shattered into 7 pieces, so it's out to 5 chosen heroes to find the pieces and save the planet. As with any other brawler, each character will have some specific attributes, as some will be fast and others will have higher damage output. Many of the enemies you face are inspired by Chinese and Japanese mythologies. You have your basic combos and desperation specials, and you can also pick up weapons like blades to deal more damage. And unique to this game is the use of elemental orbs, each of varying properties, and some enemies can be dealt extra damage depending on the orb. Since this game is done by the same people that did Metal Slug 3 and another brawler, Sengoku 3, until they become defunct in 2017, if anything, SNK Playmore should attempt to bring this game to consoles as part of the ACA Neo Geo lineup for the PS4 and Switch. It may not be a memorable brawler like Final Fight, but it's still a blast to play. I won't deny it, I watched some good amount of anime in my grade school years, like Dragon Ball, Kenyu Densetsu Yaiba, and yes, also Sailor Moon. I even played one of the games with my cousins back in the late 90s for the Panasonic 3DO of all consoles, and unfortunately, it was a garbage fighting game that sucks as much as both the Yu Yu Hakusho and Ultraman games on the 3DO. Yeah, I bet you didn't know they existed. You're very welcome. However, it wasn't until the late 2000s when I found out that there exists an arcade brawler using characters from the Sailor Moon series. You can select one of 5 Sailor Scouts, with Sailor Moon, being the protagonist, is the well-rounded of the 5, and you go through 8 stages beating down various goons and taking out bosses that are from the Sailor Moon mythos. Maybe it's just me, as I haven't seen the series in such a long time, but in my honest opinion, it is very weird to see at least 4 of the Sailor Scouts actually throw punches and kicks on demons, though it's a lot more normal for Sailor Jupiter to do so, given her backstory in the mythos. It's no wonder why she's my favorite Sailor Scout. Aside from your basic combos, desperation specials, and throws, Sailor Moon Arcade also takes a page from Golden Axe by performing magical attacks, basically screen clearing attacks by collecting crystals, which are very rare. The strength of these magical attacks depend on how many crystals you're holding, and the maximum to carry is 5. And when you execute them, you'll get an actual animation of the Sailor Scout performing their moves, which is really impressive for this game. It is a shame that this game is only up to 2 players, but it's enjoyable with a friend. With such nice graphics and gameplay, as well as the impressive animation of performing magic attacks, this game is worth trying out, should it ever make it home somehow. Long before we have the Power Stone series from Capcom, and long before we even have Smash, there's this little gem from Bandai Namco, the Outfoxes. You take control as one of the world's deadliest assassins chosen by a mysterious benefactor and engage in a fight to the death and earn cash from the benefactor. It's basically a versus game, but not in the traditional sense. You can fight close quarters, but using weapons that are scattered in the stages is the better way of taking out your opponent. They can range from swords to long-range weapons like pistols, machine guns, RPGs, or throw crates and barrels. You'll be fighting in huge environments, and just like the two aforementioned games, damage output not only comes from the weapons you use, but the environment as well, as you can also use the playing field to your advantage. It can range from the aquarium suddenly being flooded and you take damage from sharks and piranhas, to having an airplane causing turbulence and be thrown overboard, or be zapped by electricity and be flattened by machine presses, just to name a few. As far as the graphics go, it looks kinda rough, especially when the camera zooms out. It doesn't look good zoomed in either, as it looks like they just took the game Rolling Thunder, another Bandai Namco game, and just processed the graphics that way. In fact, in my opinion, it is Rolling Thunder made into a versus game, and if you look past the subpar graphics, this game is actually fun to play with a friend, and this kind of weapon and arena based versus game was very innovative for its time. It's definitely worth checking out. Here's a Capcom fighter that hasn't been released for home consoles yet. It's Red Earth, aka Warzard. This is the first game being used with the Capcom CPS3 circuit board, which was later used to run the Street Fighter III trilogy. Just like the Outfoxes, the game is also not really a fighting game in the traditional sense. You only have 4 characters to play, and you're going through different stages, killing giant enemies in what's essentially a boss rush, using the foundation of Street Fighter Alpha's gameplay, and rather than having a super gauge, you can execute super moves by exhausting one elemental orb that you collect. The only time it becomes a one-on-one fighter is when you're playing with another person. Another unique feature is the RPG element of gaining experience and leveling up your characters, and whenever you level up your characters, you'll gain new weapons or moves, and there's also a password system, in which upon entering the password, you can either start off from where you left off, or start a new game entirely with much better attributes. However, it is also a double-edged sword, as having higher stats also reflects the boss's increase of HP and difficulty. Even if you lower the settings, these bosses will not give you any chances to defend yourself, and they suffer to what players would refer to as SNK Playmore boss syndrome, as these bosses are downright cheap and will cause you to lose more quarters than necessary. It's even worse on the fact that the endings of the characters will depend on how many times you continued, and there's a high probability of you getting the bad ending. Since it's using Street Fighter's foundation, the controls are actually responsive, and the moves you pull are no different from executing any of the moves from Ryu or Ken. One YouTuber, Top Hat Gaming Man, actually touched on the subject, and he mentioned that Capcom stated 2 reasons as to why this game didn't see a home port, with the first reason being that it is impossible to run it on 5th generation hardware, which in my opinion is both true and somewhat false. Why somewhat false? It's because there is one game from the CPS3 circuit board that can actually run on the PS1, that being JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Yeah, that version may be watered down in terms of quality since it's being run on the PS1, but at least it's still functional. The second reason from Capcom of not porting the game is their concerns for the sales of their games for the Dreamcast. Let's face it, the game could have run better on the Dreamcast. I mean, it's literally a home arcade machine, and all of Capcom's games for the console are pure arcade ports. Sadly, the sales have dwindled somehow for Capcom due to the Street Fighter III trilogy's lack of support because of the lack of familiar characters and the complex gameplay, and the Dreamcast is also losing steam when the PS2 hit the scene. But then one thing Capcom could have done is that when they re-released Street Fighter III Third Strike to the PS2 in Japan, they could have done the same thing with Red Earth. It's a shame that this game hasn't been ported yet to home consoles, as I do find the boss rush style gameplay to be interesting, and it would prompt me to keep on playing and level up my character. The only time Red Earth would be referenced again is when 3 of the 4 heroes would be playable in other fighting games, and 2 of the bosses would be playable in Capcom Fighting Evolution. So come on, Capcom, release the game to our homes already! The X-Men already had their brawler game, so let's give Spidey a chance. It's Spiderman The Arcade at number 12, and I'm surprised that WatchMojo.com didn't acknowledge this game in their Spider-Man games countdown. This game can have up to 4 players, and Spider-Man is not alone, as fighting alongside him are Felicia Hardy, Nemo the Submariner, and Hawkeye from the Avengers in an effort to stop Spider-Man's gallery of rogues in the game. Unlike your traditional brawlers, this game has two different gameplay styles that can change as you progress through the game. In this instance, you're only allowed to use your basic combos, jump attacks, desperation moves, and throws. So you might be wondering, why isn't Spidey shooting web? That's when the second gameplay style comes into play. When the camera zooms out, the gameplay changes from a typical brawler to a side-scrolling platform, allowing all characters to use their long-range attacks while in this state. I actually like this design choice as it gives more variety than keeping it all plain. Also, Sega did a good job on the graphics, almost as if it is a typical Marvel comic somehow coming to life, and the animation flows wonderfully. It would be great if Sega were to regain the license for this game, as this is one brawler that shouldn't be missed. Spiderman The Arcade deserves a place alongside Spider-Man 2 the movie game, and Spider-Man PS4 as one of the best Marvel video games ever made. I'm glad to see Capcom releasing Alien vs Predator for the Capcom Home Arcade Stick, yet I'm surprised they didn't bring this game up. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, based on the comic book by Mark Schultz, alternatively titled Cenozoic Tales, in which the plot is about a post-apocalyptic Earth, where humans have to live and survive what remains of the planet, following the resurgence of previously extinct dinosaurs and other life forms. This game can be played up to 3 players, and if you played Capcom's other brawler, Captain Commando, then you'll have no problem playing this game. In fact, if you were to compare both games together, they basically took Captain Commando's gameplay engine and slightly enhanced it. You're not just fighting against other gangsters in the game, as you'll also fight dinosaurs that are being brainwashed by the enemy, and as you progress with the game, you'll also fight mutants. Aside from your typical brawler tropes, only in this game will you get to play stages that involves driving through the stage with your expensive Cadillac. That's right, riding the countryside and running over evil poachers with style. Capcom really did well in the stage design, keeping up with the original comic book's premise of seeing the Earth's ruins converging with prehistoric landscapes, and they'll keep their use of color as bright as their past brawlers before this. Just like any other Capcom titles of this genre, the overall gameplay is solid, and it really has an excellent soundtrack, especially the starting point of Stage 1, as it sounds very heroic. If Capcom is able to bring Alien vs Predator home, why not this one? It doesn't matter if it comes out on home console or Arcade 1-up, just as long as it gets released in some form or another, so that gamers of today will finally get a chance to try this good game out.
We're halfway through the video, folks. You still with me? Good to know. Here are the next 10 games that still deserve a home release. Let's get to it.
I played many rail shooters. Time Crisis, House of the Dead, Virtual Cop. There's always that satisfaction when it comes to using a light gun to blast your enemies away. Nowadays, we're using devices like the PS Move and Switch Joy-Cons in place of light guns. Even though the genre is niche these days, there's still very fun games to go back to and replay them. However, there is one good rail shooter that has yet to make a home release, and that's Midway's CarnEvil. The plot involves an unnamed protagonist who stumbles upon a golden token and a stone jester head mounted on a gravestone. Out of curiosity, he inserts the token into the stone jester's mouth, and not only did the jester named Umla came to life, but a sinister-looking amusement park rises from the grave and traps the protagonist in. And it's up to the protagonist to fight his way out of the amusement park with a shotgun that he took from the shooting gallery. There are 4 stages in the game. With the first 3, you can go in any order you want, and once all of that are done, you then reach the big top, which is the final stage to escape the park. Just like any other light gun shooter, your standard weapon will have infinite bullets, but you'll be prompted to fire away from the screen in order to reload, though some special ammo can be found and used, such as acid rounds. And believe me that you'll find yourself reloading every few seconds or so, because these enemies are relentless and they'll immediately attack the moment they see you. You'll also have to be careful of not shooting this unarmed person who will occasionally appear in some areas or risk losing HP. Given the theme of the game, enemies come in different varieties like your typical zombies, and some of them can throw knives at you, ghosts, bats, evil elves, hornets, insane amusement park staff, animatronics. Yeah, you think Five Nights at Freddy's was innovative with that concept? Well, this one predates it. And with the final stage, the big top, it wouldn't be complete without killer clowns or psychotic mimes. The bosses in the game are challenging but entertaining to fight, especially when many times all it takes is just going for their heads. And the same thing goes for this Jason Voorhees-like mid-boss, who instead of using a machete, he uses a Gatling gun for an arm. Taking the game's title to account, Midway Games got the atmosphere down correctly, and given that the graphics are all in CG and can keep up the pace of a rail shooter genre, I'd say it's visually impressive. The music really fits the overall theme, especially the song Big Bunyan Ride in Rickety Town, that while the limited lyrics sound very demented, it is very catchy. It was a missed opportunity for this game to make it to home consoles, but sadly for Midway, it filed for bankruptcy in 2009, and the majority of the assets were acquired by Warner Brothers. I think the one studio that should bring this game back would be the guys at NetherRealm Studios, the team behind Mortal Kombat, and that would make sense as shock value in their games is their specialty. Seriously, this game definitely begs for a remastered version. I just gotta include this game in the countdown as I've also played a lot of it back then. It's Michael Jackson's Moonwalker The Arcade at number 9. Unlike the Genesis version, which is more of an average 2D action game, this one is set in an isometric beat-em-up, and depending on the cabinet, dip switch settings, or a combination of both, the game can support up to 3 players, all controlling Jackson but of different color swaps. Unlike most brawlers, you're not attacking enemies through fisticuffs, but rather attacking your enemies with short-range magic, and if you charge it long enough, you can unleash a longer and stronger attack, which is useful against enemies that are more resilient. In each stage, you'll also encounter Jackson's real-life pet, and by getting him, you'll transform into a cyborg that can shoot long-range lasers, effectively eliminating the need to charge up the attack. Of course, it wouldn't be Michael Jackson without a dancing sequence. You have a token on your HP bar called Dance Magic, and upon execution, Jackson and the enemies will start dancing to the actual sampling of the song Smooth Criminal, followed by clearing all the enemies on screen. For a 90s Sega game, the graphics in the game are good. Not perfect, but better than the Genesis game. The gameplay engine is good and tolerable in comparison, and the arcade version of Jackson's songs sounded better than in the Genesis version. This will be hard for Sega to port this to current home consoles and Steam, as it is also a licensed game. But should Sega ever find a way, then the King of Pop's legacy will live on in this wonderful arcade game. Speaking of licenses, here's another one for you. Coming in at number 8, it's the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa. Based on the 90s cartoon of the same name that's trying to capitalize on Ninja Turtles' success, but it only ran for 2 seasons. The plot involves the Marshal and the show's protagonist, Moo Montana, keeping up with his duty of keeping the peace of Moo Mesa secured from outlaws, and has his allies, the Dakota Dude and the Colorado Kid, assisting him to keep it that way. The arcade game's plot is similar, only it involves Lily Bovine, Moo's love interest and saloon owner from the show, being abducted by one of the show's gallery of rogues, so it's up to the Cowboys and their friend Buffalo Bull, who in the show is a pacifistic blacksmith, to take up arms, save Lily, and restore peace to the town. The game itself is reminiscent of another run-and-gun shooter, Sunset Riders. It is run on the same engine and can have up to 4 players at a time, but has seen some extra additions. Aside from using your firearms, the heroes can also do a bull charge, not only to damage enemies, but can also break through some obstacles that your guns can't do otherwise. You're not just traversing on solid ground, as some stages will also have you being carried away by eagles and take part in the grittiest style of gameplay. You also have some power-ups that can increase the strength of your shots, as well as special one-time use bullets for extra firepower. The overall presentation is very faithful to the TV show, from the gameplay, the graphics, especially with the great use of color, the smooth controls, and the music giving the feel of heroism. Aside from being a licensed game, it's likely the game didn't get ported to home consoles due to it not being as popular as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which would have been nice if it had been ported to either the SNES or Genesis, like they did with Sunset Riders. And last time I ever seen a working machine of it, it was during my one and only visit to the Screw Attack Gaming Convention. I wish that convention is still around. Should it ever get a chance to show up on the arcade archives, you can be sure that I'll definitely get it. Lace up those boots and get ready for a slobber knocker. Joining the countdown is Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2, the sequel to Saturday Night Slam Masters. I'm very sure not many people knew there was a sequel of it. Unlike the first game, which is a pure free-roaming wrestling game, the second game plays more like a standard fighting game, but has some pro wrestling elements to it. You have 2 pairs of light and heavy attacks and a grapple button, and your stipulation for victory is just depleting your opponent's HP to 0, throwing away the need to pin your opponent. 4 more wrestlers joined the original cast of 10, and each of them not only bringing a variety of moves to the game, but each of them can be fought in different wrestling rings, which has seen some great amount of detail to each ring to fit the theme and personality of each wrestler, in comparison to the first game where it's the same ring but of a different hue or color. Just like any other Capcom fighter, each character has some special moves that they can perform, but if you want to deal big damage, you can grapple an opponent and input the commands before they break free, which is really hard to execute, but when you do, it's very amazing. I also like how the character portraits and artwork are designed, as it is done by Tetsuo OHara, the creator of my favorite anime, Fist of the North Star. I swear, it's like Capcom is losing track of so many of their past games and missed a chance of porting them. Well, that's what happens when your focus is solely on remaking things and overloading some game series with updates. Not that it's a bad thing, mind you, to some extent, but sometimes it takes going back to the past to get some ideas and refine it to make it work. I think it's safe to say that the game is for fans of the first game and wrestling in general, so should this game be released in some form or another, I'd say it's worth checking out and play. Just like Slam Masters 2, even I didn't know this one had a sequel as well. It's Snow Brothers 2 with new elves, and unlike the first game where you only have 2 players, Snow Brothers 2 can have up to 4 players at a time. Just like the first game, you must clear each area of enemies by making them into snowballs and push them away, and if some wandering enemies get struck in the line of fire, they can drop food for points or some potions that can either make you move faster, create snowballs faster, or create snowballs at a far range. The overall gameplay has seen some changes. Some stages will still follow the format of the first game in that you must clear all the enemies in the first 7 floors before taking on the boss, and you take out the boss by making snowballs out of their goons and fire back at them. You can even drop down through floors now so you can reach some items before they fade away. However, there are some stages where you're not fighting bosses and instead turns into an escape sequence where there are plenty of stage hazards, and there will be situations in which, rather than killing off enemies, you'll instead use the snowball you created as a platform to get higher in the stage. As with the first game, the graphics are very rich in color and the challenge factor is not really that bad, even against bosses, which thankfully they have an HP gauge to tell how close you are to winning. Also, having the game up to 4 players is a nice feature, so hopefully there's a company out there that can try to port this game to consoles, because once you play this game, you're in for a really fun time. From rolling down snowballs to something more explosive. Coming in at number 5 is Neo Bomberman. Just like any other Bomberman, at least in this gameplay format, your goal is to defeat all the enemies in the stage and find the portal to escape. The overall gameplay is about the same as Super Bomberman for the SNES, as the second player can also join, either for battle mode or assist you in the story campaign. The power-ups and animal bodies that you know in past games are present, and there will be some CPU characters that you can free from cages and assist you in taking out your enemies. There's not really much else on the gameplay to talk about as it's simple to understand, but it's still very solid to play. I am impressed with the game's graphics and the details placed on each stage, as well as the character design, as it almost looked like they were done in silicone graphical style. And the still frame cutscenes in the story campaign are a nice touch. Hopefully SNK Playmore can reach a deal with Bomberman's owners in order to bring this game home. It's a great game to play and still is even now. To tell you the truth, the moment the angry video game nerd made a video about this game, I just had to try it out. Ninja Baseball Batman. And no, don't expect the actual Batman to show up in this game. You get a choice of 4 ninjas, each with different attributes, followed by a cutscene involving golden artifacts from the Baseball Hall of Fame being stolen by an organization called Jado, and it's up to the ninjas to retrieve them back. Right off the bat, no pun intended, the game itself is very bizarre as everything is all baseball themed. From the heroes, the moves they can perform, the enemies, everything is just straight up wacky, even the bosses, like this living airplane. It's like someone was inspired by that one Tex Avery cartoon and make the plane evil. Aside from your basic combos, you can also input some commands to perform some special techniques to extend combos and deal more damage. The only other brawler I know that does that is Final Fight 3, and in some stages, taking a page from Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, you can also run over enemies on a vehicle. There are also items you can pick up, whether it be sub-weapons like shurikens, or this pink heart that summons cheerleaders who not only acts as a screen nuke, but they also give out some food to restore HP. Given the game's title, the developers sure had a great time making this game. They made sure that the game is very colorful as they were going for a cartoony feel, and it does bring some good humor, and the controls in the game are actually responsive for a game that's not done by Capcom. It would be great to see this game be ported to consoles someday in the future, as from what I read, this game has garnered a cult following these days, and hey, 4-player bat-wielding ninjas are a plus in my opinion. During my grade school years, I used to play a lot of Street Fighter EX, the series' first venture into 3D, and when it comes to the company Arika, the Street Fighter EX trilogy are the only games I know from them. Until I stumbled upon this one article from FightersGeneration.com about this other fighting game from Arika that I didn't know about that's published by Namco, called Fighting Lair. When I tried it out for the first time, I thought to myself that the game plays exactly like Street Fighter EX, if not better. Some of the mechanics from the EX series are present, such as hard attack stun, hard reversals, and super cancelling, while mechanics that are exclusive to this game are the ability to strafe from side to side, and some characters have basic combos by tapping one button a few times, and some can follow up with a different button. A total of 15 characters are available to play, with 2 of the initial 12 appeared in Street Fighter EX1, and 3 of the characters that are off-screen are unlockable by time release, and all of the fighters have different fighting styles to try out. The game uses a 6-button layout consisting of 3 punches and kicks of varying power, the same layout used for Street Fighter EX, and the moves you perform are actually responsive. The way arcade mode works is different from any other fighter. Aside from your standard one-on-one match against playable characters, you'll also take part on bonus matches like this night for example, and the arcade path deviates depending on whether you win or lose the bonus match, and you'll later reach a point in the game that you can freely choose your next path to take, which also determines some characters to fight. The backgrounds are pre-rendered like in EX, and the fighting arenas have walls, though they are not too enclosed, so that you can have a chance to get away if you're being cornered somehow. The character models are designed well and more defined in comparison to Street Fighter EX, where they're mostly polygonal. I think the name title alone and the cast of characters might be the reason Arika didn't port this game elsewhere and instead continued to develop Street Fighter EX 2 and 3, with the latter not being that popular. The game did get a successor in 2018 with Fighting EX Lair for the PlayStation 4 and Steam, featuring the cast of Street Fighter EX without the Street Fighters themselves, and they have Terry Bogard from King of Fighters as DLC. Still, I enjoyed the original Fighting Lair, and I hope that one day Arika will port the game to other consoles for other players to try out. Oh, shame on you, Sega. This game from their familiar franchise could have had a home release a long time ago, and that's Golden Axe, The Revenge of Death Adder. Yes, I'm aware of the news that Arcade 1UP would make a machine that has both the first game and this one, as well as the recent news of Sega's upcoming Astro City Arcade Mini, which will feature this game as one of the 36 built-in games. But because neither one is released yet, this game will join this countdown. Just to get it out of the way, I do enjoy Golden Axe 2 on the Genesis as it retains the familiar gameplay as the first one, but in my experience and opinion, it pales in comparison to Revenge of Death Adder, as this game is a vast improvement from the first 2 games. All the things you know in Golden Axe are present in this game, including magic spells, only instead of obtaining potions to raise the strength of your spell, each character will have and need to obtain a set number of potions in order to cast a magic spell, and whenever you cast one, you'll see some nice effects like enemies being burned to a crisp. The hit detection on close quarters combat is also improved. Each attack you land, it actually shows more of the enemies taking the hit, and you have new animals that hit harder than in past games, be it giant scorpions, praying mantises, or skeletal dragons. But that's not all, because when mounted on an animal, you can also pick up enemy siege weapons for extra firepower. Sega did a great job in the graphics and stage design, giving the Dark Ages setting that the series is known for, and character sprites are not only bigger, but are also very defined, just like how Streets of Rage 2 was when it improved from the first. This game could have seen a console release in the 90s, with the Sega Saturn being the likely candidate to take this game. Instead, the console got Golden Axe The Duel, which is a fighting game and not a side-scroller. I can only hope the news of Arcade 1-Up making a machine to run this game holds true, and with the Astro City Arcade Mini on the horizon, players can finally get a chance to play this wonderful game after 18 years of not being ported elsewhere. Well, let's see what game takes the top spot. Taking the top spot in the countdown is another licensed game. It's Bucky OHara at number 1. For those that don't know, Bucky OHara was a comic book character created in 1978 but debuted in 1984, the same year the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic started. Bucky would appear in a comic anthology called Echo of Future Past, though he would have his self-titled comic book some months later. The plot involves Bucky OHara, a space officer of the law and captain of his ship called the Righteous Indignation, and his crew of other animal officers and a human friend who can jump between dimensions, working together to save Bucky's universe called the Aniverse from dictatorship of the Toad Empire, led by its field commander, aptly named the Air Marshal, and his superior, a supercomputer named Complex. The comic book would later spawn a TV show in 1991 which ran for 13 episodes, some action figures, and then 2 video games in 1992, a side-scroller for the NES which is fun to play despite how difficult it is, and this arcade brawler months later. Yeah, I know I've been talking about brawlers in this countdown, but you gotta understand that during the 90s, beat-em-ups are not only a big deal, but they also define that era and are the easiest to pick up and play. Also, not every beat-em-up plays the same to a degree, as some companies would also try to make some additions to provide some variety. When you start the game, you have a choice of 4 characters: Bucky, Jenny, Deadeye, or Blinky, and the game supports up to 4 players at a time, which is always a nice feature. What makes it unique from other brawlers is that Bucky OHara The Arcade is a mix between a typical brawler and Sunset Riders, in that you can still roam freely like any other brawler, but also adds in run and gun elements as each character is equipped with a laser gun at all times. Your primary attack is your laser gun, and by picking up gun icons, you can increase the strength of your laser gun. By pressing both attack and jump, you can throw an infinite amount of grenades, and you also have a button that uses up one of your screen clearing grenades. You can also perform close-range punches, but I do what I can to distance myself and stick with just the laser, as each hit you take, the strength of your laser goes down a level. You'll be going through 8 different stages, taking out enemy toads before taking on the show's gallery of rogues, and not every stage has you going through them on foot. There are other stage gimmicks such as descending down a stage with a jetpack that lets you move in any direction, or ride a minicraft complete with laser cannons. Just like The Simpsons or Ninja Turtles, I have inserted so many tokens into this game during my grade school years whenever my folks took me to a mall that has it. It's just that addicting to me, and I kept on going until I defeated it, which thankfully some people at random joined in for the assist. Ah, such good times. The graphics are just as great as Ninja Turtles and The Simpsons, and the designs of the character sprites and stages really stayed true to the TV show. It has excellent soundtrack, and the overall gameplay is so smooth, you definitely feel like you're in control. Sunset Riders recently came out on the PlayStation 4 and Switch's arcade archives, so I can only hope that the license for Bucky OHara can be reacquired and be brought to its arcade archives. It would be great to see the game being played on the big screen, and bring both old and new players together to play it. I really can't stress enough how this game is very addicting.
And that concludes my countdown of the top 20 arcade games that I think deserve a home release. What do you think of my list? Do you like all the selections I made? Is there any other arcade game that you think deserves to have a home release? Let me know in the comment section below. There will be more top 20 videos in the future, folks. Until then, this has been Musashi X, and I bid you all farewell. Take care, and stay tuned.